Hello, my name is Nathan Mushai, and today I'll be making a presentation on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in which we're going to be looking at the bombings themselves, as well as their political, economical, and cultural effects. Thank you. Now let's start off with Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, towards the end of the Second World War, the United States had dropped the atomic bomb Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. This was an attempt to force the Japanese forces to surrender after not adhering to the terms set in the Potsdam Agreement and was the first ever use of the nuclear weapon in history. The uranium bomb had an explosive yield equal to 15,000 tons of TNT, and the bombing killed approximately 140,000 people in Hiroshima alone, either due to the bomb itself or other long-term effects. Additionally, the fireball created by the bomb destroyed 13 square kilometers of the city, thus destroying 63% of all of the buildings in Hiroshima. Now let's move on to Nagasaki. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, US Air Forces dropped a second bomb nicknamed Fat Man on the city of Nagasaki. The slightly larger plutonium bomb that exploded over the city leveled 6.7 square kilometers of the city, thus killing an additional 74,000 people. Furthermore, 22.7% of Nagasaki's buildings were completely destroyed by the bomb. On August 15th, just a few days later after the bombs were dropped, Emperor Hirohito of Japan announced Japan's surrender, therefore concluding the Second World War. In the years that followed, many of the survivors would face long-term effects such as leukemia, cancer, or other terrible side effects from the radiation, thus resulting in indirect casualties of the two bombings. However, even with the end of the bombings and the Second World War as a whole, the world had already started feeling the political, economical, and cultural effects of the bombings, thus leading to great concerns about nuclear weapons in general. Now let's start off with the global political effects. As much as these two bombings had brought an end to the Second World War, it is one of the major factors that paved the way for the Cold War that was yet to occur in the second half of the 20th century. At the time of the bombings, the United States was the only known power to possess nuclear weapons. However, in 1945, it all changed when the Soviets successfully tested their own nuclear device. With the two conflicting powers possessing nuclear weapons, there were great concerns throughout the world, especially in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is recognized as a time when the Americans and Soviets came closest to a nuclear conflict that would have that would have resulted in a third world war more devastating than its predecessors. Now let's move back to Japan. The bombings also led to Japan's surrender and the end of the Second World War, as previously mentioned. Moreover, it also brought major changes to Japan's political structure that have shaped the country into what it is today. Firstly, the United States occupying the country after the bombings, with the United States occupying the country after the bombings, Japan's military was disarmed. Furthermore, this led to the dissolution of its empire and a change in the form of government to a democracy. Additionally, Japan lost nearly all of its colonies it gained before and during the Second World War, such as the Korean Peninsula, its holdings in Manchuria and China, and multiple Southeast Asian and Pacific Island nations. Lastly, it also led to changes in its economic structure as well as changes within certain sectors of the government, such as education. Now, moving on to the economic losses. While taking all economic loss that resulted from the bombings of the cities, including the total loss of all physical property and financial assets, it is estimated that there was over 884 million yen, which is value as of August 1945, that was lost due to the two bombings. After Japan's surrender, the United States occupying led the Allies in the occupation and rehabilitation of Japan with widespread military, political, economic, and social reforms. Furthermore, the United States sank all of the Japanese military and commercial ships in the sea lane blockage, meaning they lost their means to transporting energy and materials between the island to its colony and occupied areas. The bombings also affected the Japanese production capacity, however, not as much as it had impacted its national psychologically. Additionally, the surviving factories and railroads were not operational, and with the lack of input as well, it was doomed for an economic shortage. Food shortages, unemployment, and inflation posed as major drawbacks in Japan's economy in the following years after the bombings. However, with all of these complications at hand, Japan was determined to emerge as an economic success, reluctantly allying itself with the very nations that defeated them during the war. Now let's move on to economic recovery. With the troubles brought about by the two bombings, Japan was able to recover over the following decades through the reconstruction of its cities, its economy, as well as its government. During its years of reconstruction, Japan's economy was reorganized and rebuilt, becoming a capitalist economy as well as a democracy. By the 1950s, parts of American culture became part of the Japanese landscape, and Japan began to find its economic footing as a manufacturer of consumer devices as well as electronics. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to Japan's surrender and American occupation, thus leading to these economic changes that led to Japan's economic growth throughout the following decades. Now, cultural effects. Art in its many modes provided a way for people to process the complex feelings of fear that were fascinated and stirred up by the bomb. The presence of nuclear weapons led to children during the Cold War to grow up with atomic-themed toys, comics that referenced radiation and attacks, and watched the radioactive monsters and apocalyptic scenarios featured on TV and in movies. For example, a popular Japanese created character whose creation was influenced by the bombings was Godzilla, seen as one with apocalyptic and godlike powers. Furthermore, the mushroom cloud that was created after the atomic bomb was detonated came to represent the awe-inspiring, terrible power of nuclear weapons in particular. With multiple concerns over the future of the atomic bomb, the utopian dream of a bountiful atomic age was tempered by increasing fears of an atomic, then thermonuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ethics and concerns surrounding nuclear weapons. Since the dropping of the only two atomic bombs to have been used in warfare, controversy rose over the moral legitimacy of the use of nuclear weapons against civilians. The critics hold that it is a crime to incinerate mass civilians, whereas defenders commonly claim that the bombing was necessary to end the war, therefore saving countless of lives. Even today, this topic still retains a controversial stance, as on one side, dropping the bombs caused mass murder and long-term effects on the population and was an extreme action by the US government, however, on the other side, the Japanese army was unwilling to surrender and did not abide to the Potsdam Agreement, therefore preventing an end to the Second World War. Additionally, since the dropping of the bombings, there have been concerns regarding international safety and a nuclear war. One nuclear weapon can destroy an entire city, potentially killing millions and jeopardizing the natural environment and lives of future generations through its long-term catastrophic effects. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union generated global concern and fear surrounding a Third World War that would involve the use of nuclear weapons. This conflict was at its peak during the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, as previously mentioned. Although concerns surrounding a nuclear war have alleviated over time, the presence of nuclear weapons alone is still perceived as a threat to global peace. To conclude it all, The atomic bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only caused short-term effects involving thousands of deaths, but had political, economical, and cultural effects on Japan and the world as a whole. The two bombings, causing the short and long-term deaths of over 200,000 people, led to the principal concerns throughout history as to whether it was ethical for the United States to drop the bomb in the first place, and constructed an atmosphere of anxieties and fears surrounding nuclear weapons. Lastly, these fears remain present in today's world, however their intensity has subsided immensely since the end of the Cold War. These bombings have contributed to the shaping of history throughout the second half of the 20th century, and their effects remain present in today's society. And that is the end of my presentation on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Thank you for listening to it.